Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, June the 12th, 2024. It is currently 3:12 p.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. And if you were not aware of this, times are a-changing, all right? Times are changing. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out, right? You don't have to be very smart to know times are changing, because that's what always happens, right? If you go from the 40s to the 50s, from the 50s to the 60s, from the 60s to the 70s, from the 70s to the 80s, we're not even going back to ancient times, more modern times, from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, times are always a-changing. And that brings changes to the culture. That brings changes to the church. That brings changes to philosophy, to ideologies, to politics, to every aspect of life. Things are always changing. And I love at different times to turn on this microphone and try to figure out where the times are taking us. The times are changing. That's obvious, right? They're always changing. They're always in flux. That's just a reality. But trying to figure out where they're going. Where are they going? And especially when it comes to the world of Christianity, when it comes to the church, where's the church headed? Where's Christianity headed? Now, it's easy sometimes to just look at the current state of affairs and go, disaster ahead. The end is near. It's over. And maybe sometimes that's very fair to say. There are other times that maybe you're like, wait, that looks really positive. That looks really great. And you give positive news. All you can really do is try to be as fair and as honest with the reality around you, and then try to take that reality and try to figure out where we're headed. Sometimes you can look for clues. And I think recently, all of us have been given a very big clue that something is going on, right? It was happening on university campuses, and that's all the news was talking about. College kids were protesting. They were demanding things from their university, and they weren't upset about, the condition of their dorm room. They weren't upset about curriculum. They weren't upset about something a professor did. They were upset because of what was going on in Israel and Gaza. They were upset. And these protests, I think it would be fair to classify most of them as pro-Palestinian. I think it would be they were very pro-Palestine and very anti-Israel. Some, I'm not going to say the majority of the protesters, but some of it would even, I think, be fair to say, it kind of turned into anti-Semitism. I think that would be very fair to say. And for some people, they're like, wow, where is this, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, and people say, well, no, it's not pro-Hamas. But it was Israel that was attacked, right? Israel was attacked. Over 1,000 people were killed. Some people were taken hostage. And somehow the kids show up on campus to support, it's almost kind of like, wait a minute. Why wouldn't they first show up and say, we are against this, terrorist attack against Israel. How dare you? Don't do that. Now, or something. But no, it felt weird. And I know I'm going to get emails, and people on YouTube are going to say, well, you just don't understand. And you don't understand what the Palestinians have gone through. Look, there has been lots of very bad things that have happened in that part of the world. And we could find blame on everyone's side. We could blame the United States for many of the things that have happened in that part of the region. We could blame Israel. We could blame Hamas. We could blame the Palestinians. We could blame almost, there's always plenty of blame to go around. But in this particular case, it was like pro-Palestine and very anti-Israel in most cases. I think that's a fair way to say that. Now, we could get into the geopolitical reasons. We could get into ideological reasons. We could try to take all of that apart, but that's not what this podcast is called, Theology Central. So I want to look at it from a theological perspective. Is it possible that what we saw on the college campuses Not so much a support for Israel. I think a very anti-Israel stance would be fair to say. Much more a pro-Palestinian stance. I think that would be fair to say. I think that's accurate, right? I mean, I know I'm painting maybe in kind of a broad way, but I think that's pretty accurate. Does that indicate in any way, shape, or form that there is a shift changing in the younger generation? That the younger generation is not pro-Israel. They're very much more in line with maybe Palestine, or very much more in line with maybe some of the Islamic countries, that they at least support that. Is there something going on there? I think that's something to look at. But that's what's kind of going on in the general culture. But when it comes to the younger generation within Christianity, the younger evangelicals, the younger people who are going to become the leaders of the church moving forward, has there been a shift in their views about Israel? Like, something's going on in the culture. Sometimes what you do is you watch what's going on in the culture and you start looking to see how that is manifesting or showing up inside the church, right? The church always follows culture. I mean, that's just historically true. Wherever the culture goes, the church will follow. It always does to some level. It's inevitable. It may take a little while, but it will follow. It always does. So, if the younger generation seems to be very much more pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, I think that's fair to say. I can't dogmatically assert, percentages, and be able to give you a statistical argument. But I think there's definitely put it this way, we saw more on the college campuses of people going against Israel than standing with them. I think that is true. I could be wrong, but I think that's relatively true, right? And maybe many who were for Israel just were silent. And so maybe there was more of them, but they just did not decide to start a protest or a rally. But I think it's fair to say that there's something going on in the culture. So now, how does that transfer or translate into the church? Is there a new generation that's like, you know what? We don't support Israel. We're not pro-Israel. And what follows that, if you're not going to be pro-Israel, and you're not going to be so much the support of Israel, it's inevitable that your eschatology is going to have to change, because some systems of eschatology, by definition, are going to be much more pro-Israel. God is not done with Israel. God is not done with the nation. He's going to fulfill promises for them. Like, they're still looking for the restoration of the nation. They're going to receive the land. There's going to be a new temple built. Like, all of these things are going to happen. And so they are very much more pro-Israel. Now, there's still a loud part of evangelicalism that is very pro-Israel. Well, we're not talking about the majority of evangelicalism. We're talking about the younger generation that may not be as heard, may not be as visible. They may not be as seen, because they may not be the leaders at this time in the evangelical world. But is there something going on in the younger generation, moving them away from an eschatology that would be pro-Israel to an eschatology that would be more like, Israel, whatever? Is there something happening? Well, I'm just going to put forth a hypothesis that was presented on a podcast. If I can find the page for the podcast, here we go. It actually was started as an article that was published June the 11th, 2024, so yesterday. And the headline read this way: Inside the End Times, How Young Evangelicals Shifting Views on Israel Could Have Major Implications. And I was like, oh, that's got my attention. Let me read that to you again. Inside the End Times, How Young Evangelicals Shifting Views on Israel Could Have Major Implications. Now, if you've been paying attention, we have been doing a series on eschatology. We've done kind of an overview, a survey of eschatology. We've looked at very specific systems, postmillennialism, amillennialism, premillennialism. We've looked at the Abrahamic covenant. We've looked at I don't think we've finished the Davidic covenant yet. We've been looking at very specific things related to eschatology, much more kind of an overview way instead of going, all in, and I have mentioned this kind of moving away from a pro-Israel eschatology to some of these others that would be much less inclined to support Israel, or not even be worried about the nation of Israel, thinking the nation of Israel's done and the nation of Israel's been replaced. So I started talking about that and kind of warning about that. So when I saw this, how young evangelicals shifting views on Israel could have major implications, I'm like, oh, wait, this is something I was talking about. So I scroll down and it says, there is some shifting tides among young evangelicals and their support for Israel. I'm like, okay, all right. This is what I thought that this is possibly was happening, that many, I may not have left it for just the young. I think even in many of the older generation, there's some moving away from a eschatology that's pro-Israel. Okay. So I think there is a shift in views on eschatology. I think there is a shift happening in the church. I think that that's fair to say. And it may have been going on for a while, but I think there is. And I don't know if we can be dogmatic, but at least this is picking up my concern and what I was thinking, my theory, my hypotheses. And so here's what they say. The Christian Post's John Brown joins the Inside Story to explore how the number of young evangelicals in the United States who support Israel and view it as crucial to the end times is declining. And I'm like, oh, something is going on. But I'm like, okay, the inside story. What's the inside story? And I'm like, oh, the inside story from the Christian Post. That's a podcast. So I'm like, let me go find said podcast. So I went and found podcast. Now, it took me a minute. And once I looked at it, I'm like, oh, the inside story from the Christian Post. I remember this because when the Edify Christian podcast app first, kind of came on the scene, they have the Edify Christian Podcast Network. And only certain podcasts are a part of that network, okay? And they get promoted primarily on the Edify Christian Podcast app. Now, to be fair, I've not looked at the Edify Christian Podcast app, and I don't even know how long. Part of the reason is I don't think they've done an update on the app in 2 years. I don't think they've updated the app, I think maybe in 2 years. Maybe I'm wrong. It's been a long time. So it feels like they started this thing and I don't know, it ran out of steam, funding, attention. I don't know what happened. But the podcasts are still out there, just as far as the Edify Christian Podcast app. I mean, you can go take a look at it today and see what you think. But I was really excited for what this thing could be, but it just never gained any momentum or traction. And I think the reason why is people are like, wait, why am I going to go to the Edify Christian Podcast app to listen to these Christian podcasts when I can find these Christian podcasts on my normal podcasting app? And people, but then you would think, but these are all the Christian podcasts and you may be able to discover more that way. I don't know. It just seems like it was very difficult to get people to embrace it or to even start using it. I was having a hard time even trying to get the audience of this podcast to go try it out. I mean, I had a very hard time to move anyone in that direction. People just kind of set in their way. So I don't know. I'm hoping the Edify Christian Podcast app gets a major update and they start talking about it more, promoting it more. Maybe they could do something with it. I think it still has, there's got to be something we could do with that, but I have no control over that. So as soon as I realized it was a part of the Edify Christian Podcast network, I'm like, oh, okay, I remember this one. I haven't listened to it in probably, I don't know, forever. But all right, the inside story from the Christian Post. So I grabbed the audio. You want to hear a little bit of it? It's only like 10 minutes long. Let's see what they have to say in regards to this supposedly shift that is occurring, that younger evangelicals are moving away from a support of Israel. And guess what the reason why they're not supporting Israel? They're changing their eschatology. Now, you could argue, are they changing their eschatology because they no longer support Israel because that's what the younger generation, are they being influenced by the culture? And then they're looking for a a theological reason to support that view. Like, hey, everyone around me, this younger generation, they're not supporting Israel. I'm not going to support Israel. Okay, well, I need a biblical argument for not supporting Israel. Well, here's these systems of eschatology that are not so pro-Israel. Which is moving? Is it the culture moving younger evangelicals to change their eschatology? Or did they change their eschatology and that's leading them to change their view on Israel? Like, what's the cause and effect? That's almost sometimes impossible to draw a dogmatic conclusion. But it is something to be, like when you see the culture doing it, and then all of a sudden you see young evangelicals doing the same thing. I mean, come on. It's not the young evangelicals influencing those young people on campus who are pro-Palestine. It's not getting that from young evangelicals. So to me, I'm more concerned that it's the culture influencing young evangelicals, but I cannot draw that conclusion dogmatically. Well, let's see what they had to say about this. Let's do this. This is the Inside Story from the Christian Post. Look up the podcast, subscribe to it wherever you get your favorite podcast. Here we go.
Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and I'm joined today by Christian Post reporter John Brown, who's going to be diving into a really interesting topic, support for Israel and what's going on when it comes to younger evangelicals and their support for the Jewish state. John, how you doing today?
I'm good, Billy. Thanks for having me.
So you put together a really wonderful piece. We're going to link out to it in the comments so people can read it, but we're going to be talking through this today. And the title is Support for Israel, Dispensationalism Declines Among Younger Evangelicals. This is based on a study, but you went really deep in just getting a lot of expert opinion on this. Let's just start with younger evangelicals. What is happening right now with young evangelicals when it comes to their support for Israel?
Yeah, well, the Jerusalem Post noted earlier this year that a recent study by two academics out of Boston University and UNC found that support for Israel cratered among them from 2018 to 2021. So these two professors, one of whom talked to me, they presented their findings at Tel Aviv University earlier this year. And they found that about 70% of American evangelicals under 30 expressed support for Israel in 2018, but that number had dropped to under 34% by 2021.
Wow. 2018 over 70% to like 30 something percent. We got to back that up. That's an app. You talk about cratered. What happened? What was going on in the evangelical world? That's like driving over to a cliff and just like you're looking over the cliff and then you're like, that's it. Just go. And you floor and you just fall off the cliff. Like, what happened in the evangelical world? Hey, we support Israel. Boom, we're done with Israel. Like, what happened? Okay, I got to listen to that again. Those numbers, that's not just like, oh, well, that's just a small percentage. That sounds insane. Let's listen to that again.
That a recent study by two academics out of Boston University and UNC found that support for Israel cratered among them from 2018 to 2021. So these two professors, one of whom talked to me, they presented their findings at Tel Aviv University earlier this year. And they found that about 70% of American evangelicals under 30 expressed support for Israel in 2018, but that number had dropped to under 34% by 2021. And also in 2018, only 5% said they supported the Palestinians in 2018, but nearly a quarter said they support them by 2021.
That is crazy. So like 70% to under 34% support of Israel. And then an increase in the number of young evangelicals who support the Palestinians. Okay, I try to pay attention as much as possible, right? I try to pay attention to what's going on. I turn on this microphone and talk about it. What did I miss? Like where was I? Like was I asleep at the wheel on this one? Now, I've been talking about this a little bit, but I had no idea. I knew the shift was happening. I felt that it was happening in older generations, right? That pastors or podcasters that I knew from the past, like kind of changing their views a little bit on eschatology. I felt like, okay, but I like, that is a dramatic. So all of a sudden the younger generation woke up like, hey, we don't support Israel anymore. And we're more for Palestine. What happened? Let's see if they offer any more information.
So one of the professors told me that premillennial pastors are a lot older than amillennial and postmillennial pastors, and they're also less ethnically and racially diverse, which he thinks might be playing into this.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So, premill pastors are old. Amill and postmill are young, so the younger people are being influenced by the younger pastors, not the older pastors. So are we reaching a time? Now, this could be a different shift in the evangelical mindset. Is the younger generation like, I don't like those old pastors. I don't like those old pastors. They're out of touch. They're not as diverse. They're set in their way. Like, is the younger generation, like, I want the younger pastors. And the younger pastors we're amill and we're postmill. The premill, that's old. That's antiquated. That is something of the past. That's the past generation of Christianity. That's your grandma's dispensationalism. And we don't want grandma's dispensationalism. We want the younger, new amillennialism and postmillennialism. I know, theologically speaking, the amillennialism is not young. I understand it's an old view. I understand that. But I wonder, is it that simple? That the younger generation is like, I don't want to listen to those old pastors. Now, that could be problematic, right? If you're an old pastor now, you're not going to attract a younger audience because the younger audience wants a younger person to listen to. Is that not throwing out the wisdom of the older? Is that kind of contrary to a biblical worldview? Hey, these older men, forget them. We want these younger guys. They're amillennial. They're postmillennial. So now we can be anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. All right, let's see if they give us some more information here.
And obviously, we're throwing out a lot of Christian terms. Some believers might know what they mean, some might not. When it comes to premillennial, just give a little bit of a background on what exactly that term means when it comes to belief in the end times.
Well, there are different types of premillennialism, but basically all of them believe that Jesus is going to return after the tribulation mentioned in Revelation 7 and other chapters. And they also separate the second coming and the last judgment in different ways. So the famous Left Behind series portrayed what's called the pre-tribulational form of it, which teaches that the church is going to be raptured before the tribulation. Other premills think that the church is going to be raptured at other times during the tribulation, but the pre-trib premills especially believe that the modern nation of Israel was a major step in God's timetable for the second coming.
Yeah, and obviously this discussion about Israel's especially pertinent in light of what's going on in the world right now, because it will impact in some ways potentially what a person believes about the current conflict in Gaza, when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to the quest for a Palestinian state. It will color some of that discussion, obviously. And with young people moving more towards the amillennial and the postmillennial eschatology, let's just talk a little bit about amillennial, postmillennial there. Just help break those down. I know we've got a lot of terms here.
I hate when they like, well, I know we've got all these terms and maybe people won't understand. How can anyone be a Christian for 15 minutes and not know those terms? Premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. I mean, what are you doing in church other than having donuts and drinking coffee? I mean, for crying out loud, okay? I always hate when pastors or Christian podcasts like, we're afraid to use these terms because people may not. Now, if your audience is lost people, then okay. But any Christian who goes to even a poor church, and poor means poor in their theology, should be able to know those terms. If your church just avoids theological terms or acts like, oh, those theologians use these big words, but we're not going to use those, then that's a problem. That's a problem. Okay, you don't dumb down theological education. You make the people rise up to it. You don't dumb it down. I can't stand. I hate that. Like, well, these terms okay. But for anyone, okay. We have covered all of these terms in our series on eschatology. I'm going to place this episode in that series so you can find all the other episodes. And we go through premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. We go through all of them. So, but there's a major shift from premill to amill and post. Now, the people who did the study, their basic reasons were, well, pre-mill pastors are old and they're not as diverse. There's got to be. I'm going to reject. I mean, look, the people who do the study know more than me. But in my brain, I just can't see that it's that simple. I think the younger generation is being influenced by the culture. That's what I think. And they're seeking out the pastors who are amill and postmill who just happen to be younger. I don't think they're like, that old guy over there I'm not going to listen to. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I don't know. That would be interesting to find young evangelicals under the age of 30 and see if we could find out, hey, when you listen to Christian podcasters or listen to sermons, do you avoid sermons from people who are like older, like 50 or over? Like if they're 50 or over, you don't listen to them. You only want to listen to people between the age of 20, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. But once they get over their 50s, you're just kind of done listening to them. Is it an age thing? I think there's something in the culture impacting. But all right, he's now going to explain a little bit of amillennialism and postmillennialism. Of course, they're going to do this within just a couple of seconds. You can go listen to our discussion on all of these in our series on eschatology. All right, but let's see what they have to say.
Kind of move on after that, but I think it's helpful for people to understand.
Yeah, it's very complicated. My eyes were crossing researching all this stuff, but basically amillennials and postmillennials don't believe that the nation of Israel features much in God's timetable for the end times. Postmillennials believe that the church is going to be triumphant in this world and that Jesus is going to return after that. But amillennials believe that the millennium in Revelation 20 is symbolic and that we've been in the end times since the first century, basically. So both schools of thought believe that the second coming and the last judgment are going to take place at the same time, which is not what the premills believe.
Yeah, the amillennials essentially are waiting for the second coming right now. You know, you're in the end times. There's not going to be essentially this 1,000 year, literal reign of Christ on earth. There's just going to be sort of the second coming. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The post-millennial perspective, just to sort of, add on to that a little bit, they would essentially believe that, Jesus' return when he comes, that the church is ready and that the church has the world has sort of gotten to a better place. The church has impacted the world so much that things improve, essentially, right?
Yeah, post-mills believe that, well, basically, we will usher in the kingdom of heaven in some way. And when Christ returns, he will find an earth that has been dominated by Christianity. So the millennium.
The main thing is, since they're talking about the support for Israel, amill and postmill, for the most part, they're done with Israel. I mean, Israel as itself has been replaced basically by the church. I mean, maybe an oversimplification, but they're not looking for a future regathering of the nation of Israel in the land, get all of the land promises, get all the promises fulfilled. No. Israel's done. We're the church. The promises to Israel are now ours. Those promises now have been made spiritual. They're not necessarily physical land or this or that. And so that's the big difference when it comes to, at least as we keep it in the context of which system of eschatology is going to support Israel and which ones are not, or which ones may not be motivated to do so, or feel like they have more freedom to say, I'm going to support the Palestinians.
In a way, is like a symbol of Christian dominance on the earth, which I personally, I find that hard to believe, but I do respect people that believe it.
Yeah, it's interesting, the connections, because the pre-mill and the amill would probably share more in the things may not get better, right? The pre-mills, they believe things are going to get worse. Obviously there's a lot of conversation, which we won't get too deep into, about the Antichrist and, chaos and the tribulation period, all of this sort of coming to a head, before the second coming, with, a rapture sort of mixed in there, as you were saying, somewhere along the line, depending on where you stand. Why do you think, just getting back to the generational divide, why does it matter?
Well, I think it's important because the way Christians in this country view Israel is going to have a geopolitical impact.
Well, first, why it matters is because not all the systems of eschatology can be right. Okay. There can only be one right one. So it matters because it's an issue of truth. But here, I cannot stress this enough. And so many podcasters miss this. When it comes to amillennialism, postmillennialism, premillennialism, the issue here, let me make it very clear. It matters because these issues are profoundly connected to hermeneutics. You cannot be all millennial and then have a hermeneutic that's going to say, well, that's literal Israel, that's literal land, and that's literally going to be fulfilled. You got to come along and go, no, that's not really Israel, that's spiritual Israel, which basically means the church, and that land promise is not going to be actually land, it's power or influence that's going to go to the church. Your hermeneutic has to allow for that. If you're premillennial, you're going to be like, no, it says Israel, it's Israel. When the new covenant's made with the house of Judah, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, that's literally made with Israel. God's going to do all of these promises for Israel, because you hold to a much more you'll say literal. I know amillennialists hate that and say, well, we're literal too. But the point is, there's a massive difference in hermeneutical approach to Old Testament prophecies from an amillennial perspective and a premillennial perspective, which greatly impacts hermeneutics. Because if you're going to change your hermeneutic in these areas, then how do you proceed forward in other passages of Scripture? Same with postmillennialism. These are hermeneutical issues. Everybody wants to fight, well, my system of eschatology is better than your system of eschatology. Look, I got no problem fighting for your system because your system is either true or false, and obviously you believe your system is true, which makes all the other systems false by default because they all can't be right. But to me, the greater issue is this is a hermeneutical issue. This is not an eschatological issue. This is a hermeneutical issue. Eschatology is all about hermeneutics. How did you derive that that's not Israel and that's not land and that promise is not going to be literally fulfilled when the chapter before the chapter after gives a prophecy about Babylon or gives a prophecy about there's going to be a virgin who has a child, and you're like, well, that's literal Babylon, or that's literal land, or that's literal Israel. And all of that's literal. But then in other parts, you're like, well, that's not literal Israel and that's not literal land. Like, how do you just change your hermeneutic? When it's a prophecy about the first coming of Christ, you're like, that's literal. When it's a prophecy about the second coming, you can be like, well, I don't think that's literal and that was fulfilled in the church. Well, why did all of a sudden it become non-literal? It's a hermeneutical issue. So it matters because only one system of eschatology can be right. And it matters because this has profound impacts on hermeneutics. And as he's saying, it also matters because it's going to have major geopolitical implications on, well, if the younger generation isn't pro-Israel and they're pro-Palestine, they're not going to vote for candidates that are pro-Israel, meaning the younger evangelicals may move away from support from Republicans who tend to be pro-Israel. Wow, that could be a good thing. All right, no, okay. I won't get into my whole, when I get into, people get all confused, but my issue is I think the church has been so politicized that the best thing that could happen is we have no political party to vote for, so that the church would stop worrying about voting and politics and elections and start worrying about theology, doctrine, and the Bible and the gospel, etc. Okay, but we won't get into that. All right, let them finish this up.
Historically, the U.S. has been a key ally of Israel, and a lot of that support was because of evangelicals. And I think if evangelicals stop seeing Israel as a key part of the end times and of their faith, they might become more critical of that country, which could end up having a major impact in terms of how we treat them. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and there's so much there to unpack, but the numbers are pretty shocking when you look at the support that you sort of laid out. In the piece here, you had 33.6% of young evangelicals under 30 expressing support for Israel in late 2021, but that was 67.9% in 2018. And then, conversely, on the other side, in 2021, you had 24% of young evangelicals saying they supported Palestinians, up from just 5% in 2018. So to your point,
now, even he is somewhat shocked by those numbers. Those numbers are utterly shocking. Those numbers are insane. I don't even know what's going on with those numbers. Now, what happened? Now, some of you may want to put the church stopped teaching eschatology. The church stopped emphasizing the eschatology. I mean, I don't know if we can put what happened? Those numbers are staggering in my mind. I mean, that's not just like it's a 10% drop. It's just like the whole thing just imploded.
There is going to be, a potential impact on those views in the geopolitical sense. What do we think is driving these shifts and these changes?
Well, that's the question. I mean, I don't think we can really say yet, but I interviewed Dr. Richard Land, who is the executive editor of the Christian Post, and he's a premillennialist, and he believes the shift might be happening because there's an anti-Semitism problem at American colleges, which is obvious to anyone who's been watching the news. And he thinks that might have seeped into the church.
Okay, so Richard Land seems to think it's the culture influencing the church. I would agree with Richard Land because history just always, history always leads that direction, that the culture influences the church. I mean, history proves that over and over. That was going on in the Church of Corinth. It's always happening. The culture influences the church. So the culture is seeping into the church, and now we have this massive shift and move away from support for Israel. And guess what you need? If you're not going to support Israel, you've got to change your eschatology. There's no way you can be dispensational and premillennial. There's no way you can be dispensational premillennial and say, I don't support Israel, I support the Palestinians. There's just no way. You're going to have to be amillennial or postmillennial. You're going to have to be. If you're going to maintain any adherence to your Christianity, you're going to have to.
Convince younger people to adopt eschatologies that don't emphasize Israel. And that could definitely be playing a role. But I also talked to Dr. Charles Hill, who is a theology professor at Reformed Theological in Orlando. He actually used to be a dispensationalist, but he said his studies convinced him that the amillennial perspective is what the early church believed. He came to believe that the land promises to Israel in the Old Testament were actually pointing to Christ and symbolic of his ownership of the world, and that the apostles believed this too, and that's what they were teaching. So I think there are a lot of issues.
That's such a reformed position. Hey, we believe in amillennialism because the early church did. Well, we're going to go back to everything the early church believed. Go listen to my discussion about the early church and some of their beliefs about baptism back then. Those things were baptized in the nude, crazy things, just crazy things. So just because the early church believed something does not make it necessarily true, because my understanding is Scripture is the final authority, not the early church. If we're going to make the early church the final authority, then I guess we just go back to Roman Catholicism, where we have a magisterial authority, right? But we don't have a magisterial authority. It's supposed to be Scripture. We judge the early church. The early church does not determine what we believe. We judge what the early church believed by Scripture. Is that not the non-Catholic view? And then did you hear that? That those land promises, they point to Christ's ownership of the earth. And that's what the disciples believed. Yeah, that's what the disciples believed. That's what the disciples believed when they asked, this question. I think it's in the book of Acts. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Jesus is about to ascend. Yeah, this is what, hey, those Old Testament promises, they were pointing to your ownership of the earth, right? And so, hang on. All right, here we go. Therefore, when they had come together, so Jesus has died, buried, he's risen from the dead, he's about to ascend to the Father. The disciples are there with him, and they say, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They're looking for a literal fulfillment, a literal Israel being literally restored. And of course, and any restoration of Israel is going to include the land. And what does he say? Hey, guys, no. It's the church now. It's not going to be Israel. No, he says, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father have put in his own authority. He doesn't deny that it's going to happen. He just says it's not for you to know the time. But he doesn't deny that it's going to happen. So you're going to read the Old Testament and go, hey, these promises of land and a restoration of Israel, that's all just symbolic of Christ and his ownership of the earth. Everyone in the Old Testament would have been like, oh, that's not real land we're going to get. Look at from all the discussion of land in the book of Genesis to Abraham and his descendants. Land, 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 land. Even the passages that deal with the new covenant. Land, Jerusalem, restoration, this. It's insane how you can do that. And trust me, I went to amillennial school, so I know the view relatively well. It's just, but see, it's a hermeneutical issue. See, to me, at that point, it's a hermeneutical issue. It's not even about eschatology anymore. It's like, how can I make my hermeneutic work to say that when the land was promised, that it's fulfilled in Jesus and it symbolically shows his ownership of the earth? Like, what in the world? That sounds so spiritual. It may sound so academic. And we can always say, the early church, the early church, the early church, the early church. Well, if the early church is the authority, well, then we need to develop some kind of magisterial authority that continues to have that same authority, right?
Playing into why younger Christians are moving away from the premill point of view, but it's going to take time to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think when people, go into the book of Ezekiel, for instance, and they look at the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37, it does become, when it comes to Israel, complex, because you have what appears to be 1948, right, in some ways. I know there are different takes on what's going on in the Old Testament in Ezekiel, but I do think the big sticking point here for everybody that they do have to hash through is, what are the odds that a country would go away for almost 2,000 years and be back on the map again? What, how does that happen? What other country has that ever happened with? And I think we know the answer is none. So this Israel really is a central piece of the puzzle here. And I would also say, and I don't want to over editorialize here, it is strange that the entire world, it's not as though this country came back and there's no conversation about it. Israel is very much the centerpiece of most of the headlines, as is the Middle East, going on for the last, 2 or 3 decades, right, internationally. So even longer than that. So there's a lot there to unpack. Just one other question for you. As you were going through working on this piece, because I know a lot of work went into it, did it shift or change your perspective or challenge your perspective at all, your personal eschatology? It just
convinced me that I'm not sure what I believe on these issues, because it's so complicated, and it's I often think that when Jesus came the first time, no one had everything right. None of the Jewish sects understood all of the prophecies correctly. So I don't think that anyone probably has everything right. I probably tend towards an amillennial perspective personally, but again, this is not about salvation. So I welcome any sort of debate, but
that is where I think things started going wrong. Because I heard lots of pastors start saying, eschatology, it's not about salvation. So you can believe whatever you want. You can believe whatever you want. You can believe whatever you want about eschatology, right? And that sounds so wonderful and so great. But what you don't realize is what's happening is, for you to believe certain things about eschatology has an impact on your hermeneutics. That is profoundly disturbing and concerning, right? So I think that was the first issue, is where we're just not going to worry about it. We're not going to worry about it. We're just going to play down. We're just going to play it down. Second thing I think started happening is churches. I can't stand the way many churches operate, because they operate under this assumption, right? They're like, hey, here's what we believe, and we're only going to present this side, right? We'll just barely mention the other side just to criticize it or say, this is what they believe, but it's wrong. But not really dig into each side, or let the people struggle through it. Like, okay, wait a minute. This side says this. Okay, guys, if that is true, let's see if that's true. So we're going to look up every reference to this word or this term, and we're going to look at every scripture to see what conclusion we can come to. In other words, the church loves to just say, this is what you're supposed to believe. But times are changing. Times change. Young people could be like, okay, well, you can tell me that. Get on their phone in 5 seconds, do 14 Google searches, ask AI, look up 15 podcasts and go, nope, sorry, don't believe anything you said, and you misrepresented what you did say. So what you have to do now is, I think you have to present to your audience, hey, guys, look, We're going to be dealing with eschatology. There's lots of views out there. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay aside our presuppositions and we're going to start brand new because our past understanding has no present influence on our present study. It's useless in our present study. So, all right, here's what amillennialists believe. Here's claim number one. All right, well, now let's go challenge this. So we're going to look up this and look up this. Now, guess what? Most churches won't do that because the people will get bored and they won't like it and it's tedious. Well, when we were looking up, arguments about Israel versus spiritual Israel, what did my church do? We spent almost 6 months looking up every use of the word Israel in the entire Bible. I think it was over 3,000 times the word was used. And we is that national Israel or is that so-called spiritual Israel? How do we understand that? What are we basing that on? Wait a minute. Okay, people say the land is this or this. Let's look up every use of the reference to the word land, or all the times it talks about Israel and land. Let's go through and we would just go looking up one reference after another reference after another reference, night after night after night, a Sunday night, a Wednesday night, a Sunday school, doing hour, and it was tedious. And probably anyone would have walked in would have been like, I don't want nothing to do with this church. But guess what? When we were done, there was no question or speculation or they were like, look, I've looked up every verse. I know what the Bible actually says. But churches didn't do that. And I think that was by saying, hey, this is not salvation related, so don't worry about it. No, but it's only hermeneutic related. That's profoundly impactful because that goes how you're going to interpret parts of the Bible. So even if it's not, salvation is not dependent upon it, your entire hermeneutical system could be dependent upon it. So that's number one. And number two, stop with this just like, here's what we believe and we're only going to say this. There's going to be people out there who are going to be looking at all the different systems. Go ahead and embrace the fact all the information is out there and struggle through all of it. Right, that was some of my thoughts.
I really just genuinely don't know.
Well, and I love that you said that too, because a lot of Christians get very upset on some of these issues. There's a lot of argumentation, especially on the rapture, but these are not salvation issues. They are important issues to talk through and hash out, but this is not the centerpiece of Christianity. It's a big piece of it. It does impact what we think about the world around us and theology. And again, it's important, but it is not a salvation issue. And
hey, it's not a salvation issue, so don't worry about it. We did a podcast on it, but don't really worry about it. It's not a salvation issue. Hey, these numbers utterly cratered. They could have a massive impact on our geopolitical future. Hey, don't worry about it. We're not going to deal with the hermeneutical issues, okay? But there you have it. That is the inside story from the Christian Post. Please find their podcast, subscribe to it. You see how short it is? It kind of keeps you up to date with what's going on in the world of Christianity. So it's definitely worth subscribing to. I need to subscribe to it on all my other podcast apps. I think I used to have it on my Edify Christian podcast app, but I probably need to find it on all the others. I think it should be relatively easy to find. It should be. I've got another story that kind of builds on this. This one was published on May the 29th, 2024. The headline here is Support for Israel, Dispensationalism Declines Among Younger Evangelicals. And it's a study. Evangelicals under 30 increasingly embrace amillennialism and postmillennialism. The church is changing, ladies and gentlemen. The church is changing. If the younger generation, the younger evangelicals are moving that direction, then guess what? The future is going to be maybe 10, maybe 20 years from now. It's going to be dominated by amillennialists and postmillennialists. What will be the implications to the church and what will be the implications to hermeneutics? Now, there could be a shift back, but something is changing. I mean, there was a time the church was primarily amillennial, right? I think that's fair to say. And then there was a major shift that began to occur. And then everyone started moving to a premillennial view. And premillennialism dominated the church. Now we're going to be going back to maybe an amillennial dominated or a postmillennial dominated view. What does that mean? So what I'll do is I will send If you're using the Church One app, Church ONE, if you go to the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store, download Church One app, Church ONE, do a search for Theology Central. That turns that app into our app, basically. And because it pulls everything in from our RSS feed, so you'll have all of our content. I can send out notifications on that. So I'll send out a notification which will contain a link to this article, Support for Israel, Dispensationalism Declines Among Younger Evangelicals. And you can look at that as a supplemental material for this, because it's now 49 minutes that we've been talking. It's now 4:01. I've yet to have lunch. And I'm going to die. All right, maybe that's a little bit of exaggeration, but my stomach is starting to growl like it's telling me you need food. So that's what I'm going to go do. So you have food for thought. I would like to believe that food for thought would sustain us, but we do need physical food, unfortunately. We have to have it, okay? It takes up a lot of time and it can be irritating, but we have to have it, all right? So there you go. I would love to get your thoughts. You can email me, newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Everyone have a great day, a great evening, and times are a-changing. God bless.